Hi everyone, it's Alice and I'm here today with our April wrap-up. Now we actually read 26 books in April, so it is a big wrap-up for you. Instead of doing it like I normally do and doing like a little in-depth review on all of them, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to break this down into a few different sections. So I'm going to tell you which books I read for the O.W.L.S Magical Readathon. I'm going to go through the books I read for the Stay Home Reading Rush. I'm going to tell you a bit more about the other books that we read this month, so like the ones I picked out of the TBR jar and the other ones I read for the YA Book Prize and a couple of other random titles that we picked up. But for the majority of things, because I've written in-depth reviews over on the blog, I'm going to link down in the description. So if you've got a way of seeing a review for it a bit easier rather than making this like 3.5 hours long, I'll link that down below. Our YA Book Prize review will be going up when we finish the last book on the shortlist, which is Crossfire by Mallory Blackman. So that might be after this gets uploaded, it might be just before, but like just keep your eyes out, and then that'll be going up at some point in the month of May. So without any further ado, let's get on with it. So we will start off with the books that we read for the O.W.L.S Magical Readathon. So we read for the Charms prompt, which was a book with a white cover. We read A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson, and this is Holly Jackson's debut novel, which follows a girl called Pip who is using her extended project qualification to investigate a murder that happened in her hometown that she isn't sure was actually solved. This one, 5-star read for us, absolutely amazing. It's also shortlisted for the YA Book Prize, so we read this for both of them. And it is astounding. The sequel has just been released. Really looking forward to picking it up. It's told in a few different formats, which I really appreciate. So there are interviews, there are little bits where like Pip kind of uses it as her like extended project entry logs. So you get like little suspect lists and things. It's just a really fun, really quick read. And yeah, 5 out of 5. The next book that we read for the O.W.L.S Magical Readathon was Meat Market, which was for the prompt for Herbology, which was a title with an M at the start. This, again, also on the YA Book Prize, so we did read it for both. This follows a girl called Yana Novak, who is scouted at a theme park, and she enters the modelling industry. And it is her tale as she becomes like one of the top models, but then she also goes through some pretty harrowing things and the way that she deals with those. This one wasn't actually as brilliant as I thought it was going to be. So the last Juno Dawson book I read was Clean, and that was 5 stars, absolutely astounding from start to finish. But even though I think Yana's voice is so authentically young, but I think it just went over my head a little bit. I think if I'd read this when I was a bit younger, I would have got it a lot more. But there are a lot of kind of slang terms that I wasn't familiar with because they are really new and current and like relevant. So I think Juno Dawson has done an amazing job of writing a book aimed solely at the young adult audience, but it just wasn't the one for me. So we ended up giving this one 3 out of 5 stars. So the next O.W.L.S Magical Readathon prompt was Care of Magical Creatures, which was a book with a beak on the cover, and for that one we picked The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta, another book which is shortlisted for the YA Book Prize, and thankfully another 5-star read for us. So The Black Flamingo is a novel in verse, and it follows a boy who goes to university and decides that he wants to start doing drag as the Black Flamingo. The only thing that I'm not too much of a fan about this one is the fact that actually only really happens in like the last quarter of the book. So this is much more of a coming of age novel, all about coming to terms with your sexuality, coming out, being who you are, and it follows our main character Michael through his school years from a very young age. So there's not really any other way that you could market it apart from as the Black Flamingo, because that is quite clearly the focus point, and it's his journey into becoming the Black Flamingo rather than just his story as the Black Flamingo. But I actually liked that a lot more, and I'm always quite picky when it comes to verse novels. I want them to be verse for a reason. I want it to be a clear cut, like this story could not be told in any other way. And that is exactly the case with this book, and also it's just absolutely stunning. Like, you've got little eggs hatching and there's feathers everywhere, and it's just so gorgeous. I think this is a book that you really need to read as a physical copy because so much of it is about the way that it is presented. But this was also a 5-star read for us. The next prompt for the O.W.L.S Magical Readathon was History of Magic, which is a book with a wizard in it, and for that we chose The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. We were intending to read this book in March, but we didn't get around to it in time, and honestly it was a struggle to even get through this in April. This book took us the longest read by far. I think it was like just over a week. It's just quite slow. Like, I can see why everybody raves about it, and I can see why everybody says that this is a classic, and this is like the kind of cornerstone of fantasy that you really need to be reading. I just wish I'd read it a little bit earlier, because I think I've read so much fantasy at this point that does some of the things better. I'm still looking forward to carrying on with the rest of the series, but I think if you know what happens at the end of the third book, it kind of makes it a bit pointless, because you know where the story's going. If you don't know about The Lord of the Rings, it follows a hobbit called Frodo. Is this Frodo or is this Bilbo? Frodo, yes. Frodo, whose uncle went on a journey in The Hobbit, and he has a ring that he needs to get to a big mountain thing. He has to throw it in a volcano to destroy the ring and to destroy the big evil. And this is the first stage of that journey, when he gets told about the big evil, and he meets his kind of like travelling companions and the Fellowship of the Ring, and they begin to travel together. It's fun enough, but I think because I really enjoyed The Hobbit and I read it in one sitting and it was a very quick read, this one just felt like it was really dragging to me, and it felt like the story had finally started when I got to the end of the book. So I still want to carry on and read the other two. I'm already a third of the way through it, why wouldn't I carry on? But this was only actually a 3 out of 5 star, which was a surprise because I thought this was going to be higher than that. But I'm holding out hope that by the time that I get to the end of the last book, it will kind of make sense as a cohesive whole, and I'll be able to look at it a bit more optimistically, because at this point I'm just a bit downhearted by this one.
But it has Gandalf in.
It does have Gandalf. Gandalf is the OG wizard, so he ticked off our prompt for us. Thank you, Gandalf. Okay, the next book on our Owls TBR was our arithmancy prompt, which is something outside your favourite genre. I decided for this one to choose to read The Dolls by James Patterson, because at this point, let's be honest, James Patterson is like a genre to himself. He's written romance, he's written sci-fi, he's written YA, he's written kids books, he's written crime novels, thrillers, short stories, and this was a 1 star. And literally all I can say about this is that it deserves to go in the bin. It's just awful. It's so predictable. It's just very bad. So we're not going to waste any more time on that one. Let's move on to our potions prompt, which was a book that was less than 150 pages. The Dolls was also less than 150 pages. This is how we managed to read so many books this month. We read quite a few shorties. So this is Split by Mohammed Khan. This is a short story following a girl called Salma. She gets kicked out of school? No, she gets kind of shunned by her community and judged at school because she's caught in a compromising position with a boy. She goes over to his house to do homework and she falls asleep, and he like takes pictures of her and makes it look as though they've been together, and they haven't been, but none of the community kind of believe her because she's a woman. So despite the fact that this is very short, it does deal with some quite serious things. Like, you've got a non-binary character in there who she meets, and she is she becomes friends with them, and she comes to terms with like what non-binary means and why it's really hard for this character, I think their name is Billy, to be who they are with their family, and she kind of explores why she doesn't feel comfortable being who she is with her family either, because she wants to be an actress, and that's a kind of career path that's really looked down upon because it's kind of shaming your family, because it's kind of putting yourself on the stage and making people look at you. Yet considering the fact that it's like 130 pages, I think, even less than that, 95 pages in this one, considering the fact that it's that short, it does a really, really good job of tackling those issues. And it also features characters from both I Am Thunder and Kick the Moon, which are Mohammed Khan's previous 2 releases. So if you are somebody who's read Mohammed Khan's work in the past, this is definitely a short story that you'll enjoy. It's released for World Book Day, so it's actually only £1 as well, so you can't really go wrong. But this follows the best friend of the girl from the first book, and we encounter some of the characters from the second book in this story as well. So we ended up giving this one 3 out of 5 stars. But it's definitely one that I'm thinking of rereading in the future because it wasn't what I was expecting. And I'm thinking now that like if I'd been expecting what I got from it, I would have enjoyed it more. So I think, yeah, we'll be looking at reading this again at some point in the future, possibly before Mark My Words comes out, which is Mohammed Khan's next release, which I believe is at the end of May or the beginning of June. But yeah, definitely recommend this one. So the next prompt that we read for the O.W.L.S Magical Readathon was Transfiguration, which was a book featuring a shapeshifter. And for that we read House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. So this is a chunky book. Like, it is it's like 800 plus pages, like 800 and a few, but I can say I enjoyed every single second of this. I've seen so many people say that it's really slow for the first half and it's quite info dumpy. I didn't get that at all. I thought it made a lot of sense that she was like introducing the world and she was introducing lots of different aspects, lots of different characters, but it was done in such a way that it was really easy to take in. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I didn't feel like I couldn't keep on top of anything. There was nothing that I kind of thought, oh, why is that in there? Like, it all made sense and it all works very nicely together, and you can see how well Sarah J. Maas has plotted this world out. I think Bryce, our main character, is brilliant. She goes through some traumas towards the start of the book, which I'll try not to say too much about because it's a big shock if you aren't expecting it, and I didn't know much about this book going in, so I wasn't expecting it, and it meant that I thought like the first part, kind of like the first 100 pages, absolutely gripping, could not put it down. And I think the way that Bryce deals with the trauma that she experiences and the way that she comes to terms with the events in her life is very authentic. I think that the same can be said about Hunt Attala, who is the love interest in this novel. He has been through an awful lot of shit as well, and the way that he reacts, or the way that him and Bryce kind of like bounce off each other, is all very, very realistic. Like, at times it was genuinely like I was watching the film of it in my head. Like, I could already see the way that they could adapt this. I could already see the characters so vividly, the things that they were going through. Like, the little art museum where Bryce worked, like, I could just picture it all so vividly that I genuinely felt as though it had already been adapted, and I'd already watched it and I was reading the book afterwards. And I don't get that a lot. I'm not a very visual reader. So when that does happen, it just sweeps me away. And, I mean, Lord of the Rings is like 300 pages, and that was a struggle to read, and it felt like it was the length of this book, and this book felt like it was only about 200 pages. Every time we sat down, we'd say, oh, only try and read about 50 pages of it today, and it would be like another 200, another 300 just easily just flown through. And literally my only complaint about this book is the fact that the second one isn't out until next November. Like, not even this November, November 2021. I can't wait that long. I'm going to have to reread it. We read this on the library app, and then we found the bloody collector's edition on eBay, and we're like, yeah, we got to get it. It's amazing. Like, oh, and also the collector's edition is just absolutely gorgeous. Like, it's got beautiful end papers. It's got a beautiful cover. It's just so stunning. And I wish I'd been more excited about this book before it came out, because everybody had hyped it up, and I was like, oh, I know I'm not going to like it. This one deserved all the hype that it got, and I cannot fault a single page of it. So this was a 5 out of 5 star for us, which is funny because this is now the second Sarah J. Maas book that I've read, the second Sarah J. Maas book that I've given 5 stars to, and I'm still not sure if I'm a fan of her writing. I obviously am. I'm just trying not to be a fangirl. I'm living in denial. But yes, so 5 out of 5 stars this one. I'm going to need to do like a full in-depth review of it at some point, because every time I talk about this I could just go on about it for hours. But I'm going to try to stop now, because we still have a ton of books to get to. So the next prompt book that we read for the O.W.L.S Magical Readathon was the Ancient Runes prompt, which was a book with a heart on the cover. For this we picked Deeplight by Frances Hardinge. This was also shortlisted for the Way Book Prize, so we had to read it for both. Unfortunately, we ended up giving this one, I read this one by myself, talking in plural all the time, because I just can't think of myself as a single being anymore, apparently. I read this one, and I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. It was just nothing that lived up to my expectations. I think with Frances Hardinge's writing, I'm never sure why it is marketed as YA, because it feels like a middle grade. Like, in YA, you normally get like quite a strong romantic aspect, like quite a strong kind of relationship. There's normally like some violence or some sex or some swearing, and none of those are ever present in any of Frances Hardinge's books. I said exactly the same thing about The Lie Tree, which was nominated for the Way Book Prize a few years ago, and this has exactly the same feeling. The characters are, I think, 13, but the main character feels a lot younger than that because he's kind of manipulated and led along by his best friend who is slightly older. But it's a case of this is a world where all of the people live on islands, and in the sea there are like these massive sea creature monster things who are seen as gods, and for some reason the gods mysteriously tore each other apart a few years ago, so the islands are coming to terms with the fact that their gods are gone, but they're also scavenging and salvaging pieces of like god flesh to sell on the black market. And Hark and Jelt, who are our two main characters, they go diving and there is an accident and Jelt sadly dies, but Hark finds a piece of a god and it turns out to be a god's heart, which is what is on the cover, and he brings Jelt back to life, but he has to kind of come to terms with the way that changes him. It's been kind of advertised as Frankenstein meets 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and in that respect I can see that, but it's just very, very slow. Not much really actually happens. Like, that all happens very, very early on, and then there's lots of bits where not much goes on, and I just find myself getting very bored. And I think, like, if this had been marketed as a middle grade and it had been made a bit shorter and it had been made a bit more concise, it would have probably been a new favourite. But the way that it was, it's like the gods were the smallest point in the plot, and that was kind of why I was reading it. I wanted to discover these gods that Frances Hardinge had made. I wanted to see what were these big sea creature things and why did people worship them. And I actually read the short story called Dolor's Legs for the astronomy prompt, which is to read a book in its entirety at night. This short story was a read now on NetGalley to celebrate the release of Deeplight in paperback, so I had that through there, and it was only literally between like 15 and 20 pages. But I thought that short story was actually better than Deeplight, so I gave Deeplight 3 stars, and I ended up giving Dolor's Legs 4 stars, because it really goes into detail on the god, and you get such a good idea of like the way that the gods worked and the way that people kind of worship them, and it reads like it could be a children's bedtime tale. Like, it could be a genuine piece of like a myth or legend that these kids grow up with. And I think if it had been more like that in the actual book, I would have enjoyed it a lot more. But I think my expectations for this one were just completely in the wrong place. Like, if I'd been expecting it to be more centred on the relationship between Jelt and Hark and their friendship and the way that they kind of changed each other while they were also changing individually, if I'd expected it to be more based on that, I would have enjoyed it a lot more. But as it was, it just did not hit anywhere near my expectations, which was a massive shame. The same can also be said for The Deathless Girls, by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. I mostly read this one because it was also on the Way Book Prize shortlist. I was originally aiming to read this one for the astronomy prompt, which is why I'm still talking about it with the O.W.L.S books, because I did read like most of it at night, but I ended up reading all of Dolor's Legs at night instead, so I thought I'd switch it out. But this was another one that it's meant to be the story, kind of like telling the story behind Dracula's wives, so like the brides of Dracula. But for a book about vampires, there is very, very minimal vampire content. And again, this was one where my expectations were just completely in the wrong place. I thought it was going to be a book about vampires, and it was a book about like the way that the travelling community was kind of vilified and the way that they were taken into slavery. And it was more about one girl escaping from slavery and like her love for her twin, and because her and her twin are in slavery together, her twin is taken to Vlad the Impaler's castle, so she escapes to go with her so that she can try to save her. If I'd been expecting a kind of story about sisterly love and the relationship between the two girls, I would have loved it. I was expecting a book about vampires, and it did not provide in that respect. It was also another one I just found very, very bland. I don't get this very often with books, that I get like, I don't even want to turn another page because I'm just so bored of it. But like, this one was genuinely sending me to sleep, which is why I couldn't read it for the astronomy prompt, because I was like, oh, I'll read another 20% before bed, and 2% later I'm fast asleep. It's a shame because I love Kiran Hargrave's middle grade books. I've read most of her middle grade releases so far and I liked all of them. Unfortunately, the Deathless Girls ended up being a 3-star for me. If you are somebody who is interested in kind of a book about like a relationship between sisters and the kind of connection between them, then this is definitely something that you'll enjoy. If you're looking for a book about vampires, just skip it. The next book that I read was The Gifted, the Talented and Me by William Sutclife, and this was for the Muggle Studies prompt, which is to read a contemporary book. This one also shortlisted for the YA Book Prize, and unfortunately this was the one out of the YA Book Prize shortlist that I gave the lowest rating. I ended up giving it 2 stars. As soon as it was announced on the shortlist, I knew I wasn't going to like it. I was completely right because I know my own reading taste. It's meant to be kind of like the in-betweeners in book form, and it is very much aimed at a male audience, which I think is brilliant. That's basically the entire reason I gave it a 2nd star, because I think there should be more YA authors who are aiming books at boys. But unfortunately, it just wasn't my sense of humour. There were lots of jokes about sexuality and kind of like mocking of bisexuality, and that makes me very uncomfortable. It just didn't tick any of my boxes, and so I'm not gonna say too much about it because, like, yeah, if you're a guy who wants to read more YA and you want it to be kind of like more like the boner, like masturbating joke variety, then this is a good book for you. If that's not to your taste, then just skip this one because there's plenty of other books who do like the displaced person at a new school trying to settle in better. So the last book that, no, not the last one, we've got two more O.W.L.S prompts. So we've got Defence Against the Dark Arts, which is a book that was set at sea. For this I read Atlantia by Ali Condé. This is the first Ali Condé book I've ever read, and it doesn't give me high hopes for the Match trilogy. So this is a completely underwater city. Again, a girl's sister leaves and the girl tries to follow her sister because her sister goes to the above. My main issues with this one were the fact that there's just like terrible insta love. Like they've had like 3 scenes together and they're like confessing their love for each other, and I'm just a bit too old for that kind of romance at this point. I also felt like the kind of mythology of the world was very underdeveloped, and it took me like 2 sittings to read it, but by the time that the next morning kind of dawned, I'd already forgotten basically everything about it. And that's not a very good sign when you've just spent like, oh yeah, I've spent a day reading a book and I've already forgotten what it's about. It's not the best. So this one ended up being a 2-star for us, and I actually think I'm going to end up unhauling it as well, because even though the covers are really, really cute, it's just not the book for me. And the last of the Owls prompts was our divination prompt, and that was Broken Things by Lauren Oliver, which I pulled out of our TBR jar. This one was, again, one that just did not hit my expectations. So it's a tale of 2 girls who are accused of murdering their best friend because they're all obsessed with this book called The Way into Lovelorn. The 2 girls are trying to prove that they didn't murder their best friend, and they're trying to find her murderer. This was a 3 out of 5 star. I can't really say too much about it because I don't want to give away the murderer. But the problem is that I found it quite predictable. Like, I didn't explicitly guess who the murderer was because I just didn't care enough to even bother trying to guess. I can't remember one of the girls' names. I think it's Bryn and Mia, I want to say, are the 2 girls' names. But their viewpoints are very interchangeable. So it's dual viewpoint, but it also jumps backwards and forwards in time on both of them. And honestly, the amount of times that I'd have to like flick back to the beginning of the chapter because I couldn't remember who I was following because both of their voices sounded identical. And that's like my biggest bugbear when you're doing a dual perspective novel, is that you should be able to make the voices a bit more individualistic so that people can tell instantly who they're reading. I also found that the story just wasn't really that compelling. Like, the girl who is killed is like a really horrible person, so there's not really any reason for me to care about who killed her or why. And I felt like, yeah, it was just really disappointing, which is a shame. But that does mean that we did manage to tick a book off for every single one of those Owls prompts. So even though we were only trying to get the Magizoology career path, we have completely done all of the exams, which is amazing. I don't think we would have been able to do if it hadn't been for lockdown and some very short titles, but that's pretty cool. So now I'll move on and tell you about the rest of the books that I got out of the TBR jar, because Broken Things was one of them. So we've got Dear Evan Hansen by Val Emmett, which is a adaptation of the Broadway musical of the same name. This was another 3-star book, another one that was very, very conflicting. It's just a case that Evan writes letters to himself because that's what his therapist recommends, and the kind of school loner steals one of his letters, and then that night he kills himself. So the boy who kills himself, Connor, his parents believe that he has written his suicide note to Evan, even though it's Evan's letter to himself, and Evan is too anxious, he has too much social anxiety to correct them, so he keeps getting like invited to dinner at their house, and he's like the guest of honour at the wake because he's Connor's best friend. And the first half of the novel is brilliant. Like, even though it's all about like the mixed up in communications and it makes you really cringe and you really don't want him to lie, it's so realistic because you wouldn't want to break their hearts even more. You wouldn't want to say, no, actually, your dead son didn't write that letter, please don't think that he left you a suicide note. You would just want to make these parents happier and you would want to help them. But then towards the second half of the novel, it becomes kind of more like he's exploiting them because he starts dating the girl's sister, and the guy's sister, sorry. He starts dating Connor's sister Zoe, and she is somebody he's had a crush on for like absolutely ages. So all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, your brother's killed himself, so now I get the girl, and that made me a bit uncomfortable. So it's kind of like the first half was a 5-star and the last half was a 1-star, so it just fell on a 3-star. I've heard people say that the musical is better. I will hopefully be able to give that a go one day. But yeah, definitely one that plummeted rather rapidly as I was reading it. Another book which plummeted rather rapidly as I was reading it was The Fire Child by S.K. Tremaine. There's just something about me and these domestic thrillers that are coming out of this TBR jar, because this was another 1-star. I've got a very in-depth review of this one up on the blog already. I will link it down below because it is spoilery. It's gloriously spoilery and I don't want to give too much away, but this is one that is like, it's a 3-star consistently, and then all of a sudden they start describing the landscape as autistic, and I just find that really problematic. Like, out of all the words in the entire world, why are you going to use autistic to describe a snowy landscape? That's just really derogatory and I really don't like that. So that dropped it down to a 2-star, and then the ending happened and it is the weirdest shit I think I have ever read, and I was genuinely going, oh my god, no, because it was like so cringy. Sean, I wasn't reading this one with him, and I was like yelling into the kitchen like, you won't believe what's happened now, because it's so unbelievable, it's so unrealistic. There's not enough words for how much I detest the way that this book ended, so that was another 1-star. But luckily, the last book out of the TBR jar was One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus. Thought we were going to hate this one, ended up giving it 4 stars, so that's a good time. So this is, if you don't know about One of Us is Lying, it's 5 students go into detention, one of them dies, which of the other 4 is the one who caused their death? It's a very fun little mystery. It actually follows all 4 of the perspectives, and the good thing about Karen McManus is she knows how to write a dual perspective. All of the voices are very different. There's Bronwyn, there's Nate, there's Addie, and there's Cooper. They're all very individual people. They're all very strong characters. I found myself rooting for all of them. I thought I knew who had done it, and they didn't do it. Sean did work it out, so he was a little bit bitter by the end of the novel. But the only reason I gave this one 4 stars instead of 5 stars is that one of the characters' sexualities is like a big kind of twisty plot point. By the end of either their first or their second chapter, I was like, oh, I can see where this is going. And I'm not a huge fan of books which use sexuality as like a big twist. I know that it's used quite a lot and it's quite a common trope, but it's just not a trope that I'm ever going to be fully on board with, and I was a bit disappointed to see it in action in this one. However, the character in question does have a very good plot arc, and their relationship does become less of like a twist in the future, so I'm really hoping that they will appear in the second book as well, because I'd like to see more of their perspective and more of like what's going on with them. We're not sure quite when we're going to get to the sequel, hopefully within the next couple of months, because this one was like really, really quick read. Yeah, YA mysteries just seem to be so much more successful than domestic thrillers for me at the moment, and I don't know why, but it looks like that's the way it's going to keep on going. So as well, this month we participated in the Stay Home Reading Rush. So for that reading rush, there were 4 prompts. So you had to read a book which had a house on the cover, a book which you read in one room the entire time, a book set somewhere you wanted to go, and a book that you thought would make you smile. Now, for that last prompt, I read Autobiography by Christina Lauren. This is a YA romance about a boy who falls in love with his teaching assistant, who is a very strict Mormon and is also a guy. So it's all about like kind of reconciling of sexuality with your religion and the way that it feels to kind of have all eyes on you, because not only is he a Mormon, but he's actually the priest's son, so he is like part of the main Mormon family in their community, and all eyes are on him at all times. I thought the love story was brilliant. I thought the characters were really good. There were a couple of plot points that I wasn't really on board with that I can't go into too much because I don't want to spoil it, but again, like, I'll link the reviews down below if you'd like to see more spoilery thoughts on that one. I think I ended up giving it 4 stars. I want to say it was a 4-star. Jumping all the way over with my list. Yes, so I ended up giving it 4 stars. It could have easily been a 5-star if there hadn't been one little thing that annoyed me too much. But I can see why everybody recommends this one, and I can see why people like Christina Lauren's writing so much, because I've only read one other of their books, and that was The House, and it was kind of marketed as a horror, but it was more of a romance, and again, not what I was looking for, so I did not rate that one highly. But I knew what I was getting going into this one, a nice, happy, kind of contemporary with some, like, deeper subjects woven throughout, and I really enjoyed it. So for the second prompt, which was to read a book that had a house on the cover. No, house on the cover, I don't know which order the prompts went around in, but either way, for the house on the cover, we read The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. This is the first book in a trilogy that's been recommended a lot, and we both ended up really enjoying it. This was a 4-star for us. Hard to say too much about it because it's like a twist on Russian folktale. There's some kind of like Jack Frost in there, but there's a lot going on, and it's a story that it develops quite slowly, and I think by the time that the trilogy is finished, I might end up like liking this one a little bit more, because I think it does set up a lot for the future. Yeah, we gave it 4 stars, but it was like so close being a 5 if it had just been a bit pacier. The description is absolutely gorgeous though. We're definitely planning on carrying on with this very soon. And the last book we read for the Stay Home Reading Rush for the final 2 prompts, ticking off both of them, was The Hand on the Wall by Maureen Johnson. Again, this is a book I can't say too much about because this is the 3rd book in a trilogy. It's the end of the Truly Devious series. We ended up giving it 3 stars because it just feels like not an awful lot happens. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of, like, there's one big twist right at the beginning and then nothing else really happens until the end, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, which is really disappointing because this is a series that has gone from 5 to 4 to 3. Not what we were expecting, but I'm glad that we managed to get the series finished because it was one of my most anticipated releases of this year, which, of course, it would end up being awful. So for the YA Book Prize, we also reread Furious Thing by Jenny Hammond. I've already wrapped this one up in our October or November wrap-up, so I'll link that down below as well. But I've actually dropped our rating from 5 stars down to 4 stars on this one, and we also reread The Places I've Cried in Public by Holly Bourne, which stuck at a 5-star. This book is still absolutely amazing. I can't recommend it enough, and if you haven't read it yet, you need to. And the last book that we've read for the YA Book Prize so far is The Quiet at the End of the World by Lauren James. This was another book that just wasn't at all what I was expecting. So it's quite a difficult one to read at the moment because it's actually based on a pandemic virus that infects the world and turns everybody infertile. So considering the way that the world is at the moment, you might want to avoid this one. But I ended up not liking it for a few different reasons. I don't want to give too much away, but there's like a big twist and the whole storyline kind of hinges on that twist, but I kind of could see it coming because there are little bits dropped through that make you think that it's just really badly edited. which is horrible, but it does make you think like, oh no, none of this makes any logical sense. This year is wrong. This is wrong over here. But actually it's all kind of meant to be dropped through so that when you have the reveal, you're like, oh, that all makes sense. But for me, it was more a case of like, oh, I already saw all of those and I was really disappointed that there were so many errors in this book. There weren't. So, yeah, that wasn't the best way to drop crumbs through the storyline. Again, full review of this one elsewhere, but yeah, we ended up giving this one 3 out of 5 stars. I'm beginning to wish I'd given it less. It was more like a 2.5 that I rounded up to a 3, but probably should have rounded it down to a 2. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. Either way, it's not going to be my book prize winner, as you can tell by the fact that we've already mentioned 3 others from the shortlist that are 5 stars. So we've already got a couple other books to talk about today. Right, so read Noughts and Crosses, because Crossfire, the 5th book in the series, is on the way book prize. So we read Noughts and Crosses, we read Callum, the World Book Day short story, and our copy of Noughts and Crosses also had an eye for an eye at the end of it, which is a short story that is set between book 1 and book 2. All of them got 4 stars. It's a very, very good series. I've already read them when I was younger and I loved them, and if you don't know too much about them, this is a world where black and white are switched. So all of the people in power are black and all of the people who were slaves and are coming out of slavery are white. And it's such a simple but effective change to the world, and it makes you look at race in a completely different way, and Mallory Blackman is an absolute genius and I can't recommend it enough. I think if I'd been able to remember the first book less, I would have probably ended up giving it 5 stars. But I could remember it a lot, so it didn't have as much of an emotional impact the second time around. But then it also proves that it's a very memorable book, because I first read this when I was like 11 or 12, and I can still remember it 13 years later, basically page for page. We're carrying on with the rest of the series in the attempt to read Crossfire before the Way Book Prize winner is announced. So we will get our thoughts on the rest of the books next month. But all I can say so far is that this is very much clearly a 4-star series. Not as huge a fan of the short story, because it is like a what if, like switching a scene from the first book and saying like what if it happened slightly differently. It's clever and it works very well because it still ends in a way that all of the characters will end up where they do at the end of the book, which is genius. But it just felt like one of those, like, if you're a really big fan of the series, pick that one up. If you're not hugely in love with it, that one's one that you can kind of skip over. We also read The Lizard by Dugald Bruce Lockhart for a blog tour that I took part in. This was another 4-star. It was an overwhelmingly 4-star month for us this month. Following a guy who goes to Greece to kind of track down his ex-girlfriend in the hopes that he can win her back. And he actually ends up getting involved in a guy who he gets people to pose nude for him so that he can paint them, and then he sleeps with them, but he pays them to sleep with them. And the guy, Alistair, who is doing this, thinks that that's kind of all it is, but actually most of the models are ending up dead. So he gets framed, and he's like, oh no, I was only letting him sleep with them. Oh no, he was murdering them. And then it gets very, very wacky from there on out. Like, that's just like the first 25% of the book. The other 75% are just wild. Like, it is such a high octane journey, and the author has actually been in touch with me to say thank you for the blog tour, and also to let me know that he is writing the sequel, which is really exciting, because at the end of the blog tour post I was like, I really hope there's a sequel because I'm gonna pick it up if there is, and he's like, yep, I'm halfway through it, so got that to look out for. So yeah, so if you're interested in books that are kind of like, it's set in the 80s, if you're missing the fact that you're going to be able to go on holiday this year, go and pick that up, because honestly, the location, so well described. You really do feel like you're on like a hot sunny island somewhere being chased by the law. So good. And the last book that we read in April was Blood Moon by Lucy Cathcart. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her surname. This is a verse novel, a debut novel from Walker Books. They kindly accepted me to read it through NetGalley. And it's all about a girl who gets her first, not her first period, she has her first sexual experience, and then she has her period, and this comes out in the school, so she's kind of like made a mockery of because, like, oh, she's let somebody do sexual things to her while she's bleeding. I think it's very powerful. As I said earlier, I like it when books in verse are kind of told that way for a reason, and I feel like that's the case with this one. It also links very nicely because, as you can tell with the title, Blood Moon, our character is very, very interested in astronomy, and there's lots of things about the blood moon in there, so there's lots of like deeper meanings and extra levels on this one. It's a good look at kind of friendship and the way that friendships can fall apart and then come back together in times of crisis. Very powerful, and I very much enjoyed this one. Read it in just over one sitting. I think I read like 3/4 of the book and then just finished it off like the next morning. But this is definitely one to keep an eye out for. And as it is Lucy's debut novel, I'm blown away. And definitely one that you want to be supporting. I believe it comes out either at the end of May or the beginning of June. But keep an eye out for this one because it's going to be a big release for this year, and I would not be surprised if it ends up on the Waybook Prize for next year because... And that's it. We read 26 books, and it didn't take 3 hours to talk about them all, which is amazing. If you've also read any of these books, leave your thoughts down below. Check out all the links that I mentioned in the Doohickey Mabob, so the reviews from the blog, bits like that. And I guess we'll see you next month. Will we be able to read more? No, because like 5 days into May now we've read like 3 books, but considering we were like low-key aiming for 30 in 30 days, we ended up on like 26/27 in 30 days. I'm going to take that as a win. Yeah, if you like this video, give it a like, do some subscribing. I would say hit me up on Twitter, but you can't because my account's still locked. But one day I'll be back. Yeah, see you next time. Bye.